Because Syracuse is a Northeast program, this is bound to come up. In fact, it has already been brought up. And of course, I am referring to the possibility of Fran Brown being the next head coach of Penn State. Now, I want to preface this conversation by saying this. I think it's unlikely that Fran Brown becomes the next head coach at Penn State. But let's go over it here on Locked On Syracuse right now. So USA Today, after the firing of James Franklin over at Penn State, released an article of, I believe, 9 potential head coach candidates for Penn State. And one of the coaches that USA Today listed was Fran Brown. And I'm going to read to you what USA Today had to say about Fran Brown and the possibility of Penn State choosing him. Quote, Brown, a second-year head coach at Syracuse, has limited head coaching experience, but has made a mark after taking the job in 2024. Brown was the defensive backs coach at Georgia from 2022 to 2023 after serving in a variety of roles at Temple and Baylor under Matt Rule. The Camden, New Jersey native was also at Rutgers from 2020 and 2021. Brown led Syracuse to a 10-3 record last season, and the Orange were 3-1 this year after an upset of Clemson. But with starting quarterback Steve Angeli injured in the defeat of the Tigers, Syracuse has lost 2 in a row. End quote. So that's what USA Today had to say about Fran Brown and him being a candidate for the Penn State head coaching job. Furthermore, our very own Locked On Nittany Lions host Zach Seiko put out a feeler tweet on his personal Twitter asking Penn State fans what they thought about the idea of Fran Brown being the next head coach of Penn State. And I know from chatting with him just a little bit, I'm not giving away too much of our whole conversation that we had. So shout out, Zach, if you are watching or listening to this podcast right now. He does like Fran Brown. Don't get me wrong. He does like Fran Brown, although the fan base kind of seems a little bit split on Fran Brown being the next head coach over at Penn State. Fran Brown, for what it's worth, he was asked about it at his press conference on Monday, the possibility of him being the head coach at Penn State, which he quickly shot down. And I expect nothing less from Fran Brown in his press conference on a Monday. It's game week. Syracuse is getting ready to take on the Pitt Panthers. Of course, he is going to shut that down. I mean, why is he going to go out in public and say, hey, of course I'm going to consider the possibility of becoming the next Penn State head coach? So I don't take too much stock into Fran Brown shooting it down immediately in the press conference, because that is not the time or the place to entertain the idea of taking another coaching job when you're still in the middle of this season. There's no point, right? So I commend Fran Brown for that, but that doesn't mean that if the season were to end tomorrow, that he wouldn't have any sort of interest in Penn State. It's just that right now, time and place for everything, there's no point in really thinking about it. His job is to get Syracuse ready for Pitt, not to consider leaving and going to Penn State. My thoughts on this, like I said at the very top of the segment, I think it's unlikely that Penn State fired a very good head coach in James Franklin so that they could hire Fran Brown. And I say that in a way where it might sound like I'm putting down Fran Brown, but rather I think it's because they're chasing bigger. Fran Brown is a quality candidate probably for some teams, although those teams would probably not be any more or less desirable than just staying with Syracuse. But for Penn State and what they're looking for and the coach that they have to replace, I can't see them all of a sudden pivoting to Fran Brown. It just seems very, very unlikely. You already think about some of the big names that they are chasing. Matt Rule is someone that they're definitely going after. I believe he's at Nebraska right now, and he has obviously some Penn State connections. Curt Cignetti, the head coach over at Indiana, doing a fantastic job. I think that Penn State might offer him a blank check. They might. I mean, he's the type of guy that you would want if you're Penn State. If you're firing James Franklin, well, you might want to hire the guy who has taken Indiana football to new heights, that just went into Oregon, one of the toughest places to play in the country, and won. They're so good at home that Ohio State last year didn't even beat them on their home turf. And Indiana goes into there last weekend and they won, to their credit. So Curt Cignetti, obviously, now he is the number one guy on pretty much every head coach job board. And Penn State, barring anything super unlikely, is going to be the number one team looking for a head coach. It's going to be them and probably the Florida Gators if and when James Franklin, if and when Billy Napier is fired by Florida. The reality with Fran Brown is that I think he would be a much more attractive candidate to Penn State had Steve Angeli remained healthy for Syracuse. Because as USA Today pointed out in their article, Steve Angeli goes down against Clemson, and Syracuse since that point has lost 2 straight. And now, if we're being realistic, Syracuse fans, it's pretty unlikely, based on what we have seen from Rickie Collins, that this team is going to find a way to split the final 6 games of the season, which is what they need to do to make a bowl in 2025. So it's a little bit unfair to Fran Brown. I understand that. But good luck selling to the Penn State fan base that just fired James Franklin on a head coach from Syracuse, which, yeah, had a great first year, but in the second year missed a bowl. I just think that that's unlikely to happen for Penn State. I think the only world in which they really consider Fran Brown, not that they won't do their homework on him, but that they really strongly consider him, is either Syracuse does manage to have a good second half of the year. I guess it's possible that they could have a good second half of the year. But it's also that they might strike out on some of their big-time targets. If Matt Rule says no, Curt Cignetti says no, a few other coaches also say no, then maybe they have to go with Fran Brown by default. Because it's not like he's a bad candidate. He's probably just not the best candidate for Penn State. Probably not even in their top 3 best candidates, if we're being honest. I do think there's an alternate universe, though, where Fran Brown could have been in that upper echelon of head coaches for Penn State. And that alternate universe is very simple. Steve Angeli remains healthy for Syracuse. And you saw what Syracuse was doing with him healthy with that upset of Clemson. Perhaps Syracuse would have contended once again in the ACC. And then Fran Brown would have had 2 very successful years at Syracuse. And he's a Northeast guy. And Steve Angeli has eligibility for 2026. He might bring Steve Angeli over to Penn State. Got to consider that, right? They would have a quarterback for next year, a proven quarterback that's really good. We see this all the time in college football. John Mateer, there's a reason why he's at Oklahoma. The reason why he's at Oklahoma was A, they paid him a lot of money, and B, they brought over his offensive coordinator to Oklahoma from Washington State. Right there, you got the connection with your coordinator, same coordinator, a lot of money, new team. In an alternate universe, Fran Brown could have done that with Steve Angeli. New team, more money, big-time program, the whiteout, all that. You could sell a lot of players on Penn State. Combine that with maybe 5-star wide receiver Calvin Russell. I mean, he's committed to Syracuse because of Fran Brown. I wouldn't be surprised if he followed Fran Brown anywhere. Demetrius Samuel, the true freshman corner, recently named midseason true freshman All-American. He would probably come too. Now, I'm just speculating on that, but it's an informed speculation. It's understanding that a lot of these players have a terrific relationship with Fran Brown, and had Fran Brown had a very good season this year, had Steve Angeli really remained healthy, yeah, there was a world in which I think that this would be much, much bigger, that Fran Brown would be one of the upper echelon candidates for Penn State. But ultimately, the reality is Syracuse unlikely to make a bowl in 2025, and I just can't see Penn State hiring a head coach a year after they just missed a bowl at Syracuse. So I think the odds of Fran Brown becoming the head coach at Penn State are very low. I don't think it's impossible, but I do think it is pretty low. I think the far more likely outcome is that maybe Penn State decides to poach one or maybe several coaches from this coaching staff to add to their brand new coaching staff for 2026.